Story 1.
I'm not one to scare easily. I've always been the type to roll my eyes at horror movies and mockingly shout, "Don't go in there," at the screen. But what happened to me one night when I was home alone changed all that. It made me believe that sometimes the world has its own way of showing us that not everything can be explained away so easily. It was a typical Friday evening. My parents had gone out for their usual weekend dinner, leaving me in charge of the house. I was 19, a college student on summer break, relishing the freedom of having the place to myself. The plan was simple: pizza, a marathon of my favorite show, and maybe a little studying if I could muster the motivation. The night started off without a hitch. I ordered my pizza, queued up my show, and settled into the couch with a blanket. It wasn't until around 9 p.m. that things began to feel off. I heard what sounded like footsteps upstairs. Thinking it was just my imagination, I paused my show and listened. Silence. I shrugged it off and hit play again. But then, it happened again. This time, I couldn't ignore it. The footsteps were distinct, deliberate even. My heart raced as I considered the possibilities. Could someone have broken in? My parents had a security system installed. But had we remembered to set it? I grabbed my phone, ready to dial 911, but then hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if I was overreacting? Instead, I texted my best friend, Jenna, who lived a few blocks away. She replied instantly, offering to come over. Relieved, I waited for her, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. Jenna arrived in record time, armed with a flashlight and her unwavering skepticism. We did a sweep of the house together, checking every room and closet. Nothing was out of place, and no one was there. Feeling a bit foolish, but still unnerved, we decided to camp out in the living room for the rest of the night. We were halfway through an episode when the TV suddenly switched off by itself. Jenna and I exchanged a look of confusion before I got up to check the remote. It was right where I'd left it on the coffee table, untouched. As I stood there trying to make sense of it, Jenna pointed behind me, her face pale. The kitchen light was flickering on and off. We approached cautiously, half expecting to find an explanation that would make us laugh about this later. But when we reached the kitchen, we found nothing amiss. The switch was in the off position, yet the light continued its erratic dance. It was then that we heard it, a soft whispering coming from the living room. It sounded like someone muttering under their breath, too low for us to make out the words. We froze, fear rooting us to the spot. The whispering stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving us in stunned silence. Jenna grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. "This is too weird," she whispered. We decided to leave, grabbing our things and practically running out of the house. We spent the night at Jenna's place, too scared to go back until daylight. The next morning, we returned with Jenna's older brother in tow. The house was exactly as we'd left it. Doors locked, windows secure. Nothing was amiss. It wasn't until later that day that we discovered the cause of our terror. The footsteps? Our neighbor's cat had found a way into our attic through a small opening we'd never noticed. The TV and lights? A faulty electrical circuit that had chosen that night to act up. And the whispering? Our own paranoia amplified by a voice message left on our landline by my aunt, which had somehow played itself on speaker. In the light of day, everything made sense. There were logical explanations for each event that had scared us so badly, but sometimes, when the house creaks at night, or shadows seem to move just beyond my line of sight, I remember that feeling of sheer terror, and I wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's more to this world than what can be easily explained away.
Story 2.
Living alone has its perks, but it also comes with its fair share of eerie experiences, especially if you're me. I'm Alex, by the way. I moved into this apartment about a year ago. It's a decent place. Not too shabby or luxurious, just right for a guy like me. However, something happened last month that I still can't quite wrap my head around. It started off as a regular Thursday evening. I got back from work, microwaved some leftovers, and settled down with my laptop to binge some series. That's when I first noticed it. The clock on the wall was going backwards, not in a slow, Hey, is that moving the wrong way? Kind of sense. It was blatantly moving in reverse, secondhand ticking away as if time itself had decided to play a prank on me. I rubbed my eyes thinking the long hours at work were finally getting to me, but nope, the clock kept at it. I even took a video on my phone to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The next oddity didn't wait long to introduce itself. My phone, which I had just used to record the clock, suddenly displayed a date from 2 years ago. The battery drained from 60% to 15% in a matter of seconds before my eyes. Trying to shake off the unease, I decided to call it a night early. Maybe I just needed a good night's sleep. But as soon as I switched off the lights and got into bed, the room got inexplicably cold. And I mean cold. We're talking middle of winter with no heating kinda cold. In the middle of September, I could see my breath fogging up in the air above me. I scrambled out of bed to check the windows, shut tight. The heating was on full blast, but made no difference to the chill that had settled in the room. I ended up sleeping, or rather trying to sleep, under 3 blankets that night. The next morning, I woke up with the sun shining through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. The eerie cold from the night before had disappeared, leaving me to wonder if it had all been a vivid dream. Still, the unease lingered like a bad aftertaste. I decided to investigate the odd occurrences, starting with the clock. It was back to ticking away normally, as if mocking my confusion. The video on my phone, however, confirmed that I hadn't imagined the backward movement. I spent the day at work, distracted, unable to shake off the feeling that something was amiss. When I returned home, I resolved to find some logical explanation for everything. I dug out the warranty and manual for the clock, thinking maybe it had some sort of reversey feature I wasn't aware of. A long shot, but I was desperate for answers. Nothing in the documents indicated such a feature. My next step was to research the history of my apartment. Perhaps there was something about its past that could explain these anomalies. After hours of digging through online records and local archives, I stumbled upon an interesting piece of information. The building used to be a watchmaker's shop over a century ago, renowned for its exquisite handmade clocks. The shop was run by a reclusive craftsman known for his eccentric experiments with timepieces. This discovery piqued my interest. Could there be some connection between the watchmaker's experiments and what I was experiencing? It seemed far-fetched, but at this point I was open to any explanation. My research also led me to an old forum where people shared stories about unusual occurrences in their homes. There, I found a post from someone who had experienced similar time-related anomalies. They suggested that sometimes, places retain echoes of their past, manifesting in ways that defy logical explanation. Feeling somewhat reassured that I wasn't alone in my experiences, I decided to embrace the mystery rather than fear it. That night, as I lay in bed, I spoke aloud into the darkness, addressing the old watchmaker's spirit. I acknowledged his presence and expressed my admiration for his craft. To my surprise, the room didn't get cold that night. Instead, there was a comforting warmth, as if the apartment itself was responding to my acceptance. From then on, the odd occurrences became less frequent and less unsettling. I even found myself looking forward to these peculiar reminders of the apartment's history. Living alone certainly has its eerie moments, but it also offers unique opportunities to connect with the past in unexpected ways. My experience taught me that sometimes, embracing the mystery can transform it from something fearful into something fascinating.
Story 3.
I'm not one for believing in the supernatural or anything, but let me tell you about this one time that really made me question everything. I was staying at my uncle's country house for a weekend. He had this old kind of run-down place out in the middle of nowhere, said it was good for the soul to be away from the city once in a while. I thought, why not? A little peace and quiet could do me some good. The first day was pretty uneventful. I arrived in the afternoon, unpacked my stuff, and just chilled, enjoying the silence and the fresh air. But as night fell, things started to get a bit odd. It began with the lights. I was sitting in the living room reading a book when the lights flickered off and on. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, it's an old house, right? Wiring's probably not the best. But then it happened again, and this time, the light stayed off a bit longer before flickering back on. It was annoying, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe I should find some candles just in case. So I went to the kitchen to look for candles. That's when I heard it, the sound of something moving upstairs. It was subtle, like the floorboards just settling, but it definitely sounded like footsteps. My heart raced a bit. I knew I was alone in the house, or at least I was supposed to be. I told myself it was nothing, just the house being old and creaky. Armed with a candle, I decided to check it out because there was no way I'd be able to relax otherwise. As I made my way upstairs, the sound stopped. I checked each room, flicking on the lights. Thankfully, they were working again and found nothing. No sign of anyone or anything out of place. Feeling a bit foolish but relieved, I went back downstairs. I settled back into my book, trying to shake off the unease. That's when I noticed the window. It was open. Now this freaked me out because I was sure I hadn't opened any windows when I arrived. It wasn't particularly hot or anything. I got up to close it, and that's when I saw something in the garden that made my heart skip a beat. A shadowy figure standing near the trees, just looking at the house. I blinked, and it was gone. Just like that. No sign of anyone or anything out there. I locked the window, checked all the doors were locked too, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination getting the better of me. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. But by morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and I felt silly for letting my imagination run wild. The day passed without incident, and by evening, I was almost convinced that I had indeed let fear get the better of me. That was until the sun began to set, and an inexplicable feeling of dread settled over me. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the unease was impossible to shake off. How darkness enveloped the house once more. The lights began their erratic dance again, flickering off and on, off and on. This time, however, when they went out, they didn't come back on. I was plunged into complete darkness. The silence of the house was suddenly broken by a soft, melancholy tune playing somewhere in the depths of the house. It sounded like a music box. Heart pounding, I grabbed the flashlight I had found earlier in the day and followed the sound. It led me to the attic door. The music grew louder as I approached, compelling yet terrifying at the same time. With a shaky hand, I opened the door and climbed up the stairs. The attic was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, creating ghostly shapes in the dim light of my flashlight. In the far corner of the room, I found the source of the music, an ancient music box, intricately carved and surprisingly well-preserved among the dust and cobwebs. As I reached out to touch it, the music stopped abruptly and the house fell silent once more. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the attic, causing the sheets to billow like specters rising. And then, as if orchestrated by unseen hands, photographs began to fall from a nearby shelf, fluttering to the ground around me. I picked one up and gasped. It was a photo of my uncle, much younger, standing beside a woman and two children I had never seen before. They were all smiling, happy. Confused and shaken, I hurried downstairs with the photograph in hand. When my uncle arrived the next day, I confronted him with the picture. After a long pause, he finally revealed a secret he had kept hidden for years. Before I was born, he had another family, a wife, and two children, who had tragically died in a car accident. The pain and guilt had been too much for him to bear, so he never spoke of them. I'm not one for believing in the supernatural or anything, but that weekend at my uncle's country house made me question everything I thought I knew about life and death. And somehow, in uncovering his secret past, I helped my uncle find a semblance of peace, a way to remember his lost loved ones without the overwhelming pain that had silenced him for so long. From then on, every time I visited, I made sure to play the music box at least once, a small tribute to those who had once called that house a home. And each time I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched over by unseen eyes. but this time it felt comforting rather than terrifying.
Story 4.
It was a regular Thursday evening. I had just gotten off a video call with my friends, laughing over some silly joke one of them made. I remember feeling relaxed, almost sleepy, as I made my way to the kitchen to grab a snack. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet you only notice when you're by yourself. I was living in a small suburban area, where neighbors knew each other by name, but mostly kept to themselves. My parents were out of town, and I was enjoying the solitude, or at least I thought I was. As I stood in the kitchen munching on some chips, I heard a knock on the door. It was odd because it was past 9 p.m., and we rarely had visitors at that hour. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to the door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was some kids playing pranks. I went back to the kitchen, but then there was another knock, this time louder. A sense of unease began to crawl up my spine. Again, I checked, and again, no one was there. My heart started to beat a little faster, not out of fear, but more out of confusion. Who would do this? I decided to ignore it, thinking if it were someone needing help, they would have shouted or said something. So I went upstairs to my room, trying to shake off the weird feeling settling in my stomach. I was halfway through an episode of my favorite show when I heard it. The sound of the front door handle moving. My first thought was, did I forget to lock the door? But then I remembered clearly locking it after checking the second time. I paused my show and sat there, listening. The handle moved again, more aggressively this time. Someone was definitely trying to get in. Panic started to set in, but I forced myself to think. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but then a thought stopped me. What if it's just a misunderstanding? What if it's a neighbor who's locked out or something? I decided to go down and check through the window next to the door instead of making a scene. As quietly as I could, I made my way downstairs. The sound stopped as I reached the last step. Holding my breath, I peeked through the curtain. There was a man outside. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there looking at the door. He didn't seem like he was trying to break in anymore. He just stood there, which somehow made it even more terrifying. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't one of our neighbors or anyone I had seen before. My mind raced with what to do next. That's when he turned and looked directly at where I was hiding behind the curtain. It felt like he could see me even though it was dark inside. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This person had no business being here at this hour. I dialed 911 and whispered my situation and address to the operator, who assured me that help was on the way. The man didn't try to get in again. He just stood there until the police arrived. They found him still standing there, staring at the door. They questioned him, but he wouldn't say anything, just kept staring. The police took him away, and they told me he was known to them, someone with a history of wandering into people's properties. They said he was harmless, but advised me to keep my doors locked and call them if anything else happened. After they left, the house felt different. Like the silence wasn't as comforting as before. It took me a while to feel safe again in my own home. That night showed me how quickly things can change, how quickly normal can turn into something else entirely. It also taught me always to trust my instincts and not hesitate to call for help when something doesn't feel right. I still live in that house, and nothing like that has happened since. But sometimes, when it's quiet and I'm alone, I can't help but listen a little more closely for any sounds out of place.